So I thought we'd start with a very kind of obvious question, which is why would you do the RE5 exam in the first place? And the answer to that is, well, it depends on who you are. There are two kinds of people who might want to do the RE5 exam. And uh, one of those kinds is a supervised rep. So somebody who is actually a representative at a financial services provider under supervision. They have to do the RE5 exam, right? And I think some of you will know what I'm talking about. When you first get appointed, that is called your DOFA, your date of first appointment. And the clock starts ticking at that point. During the next few years, you need to obtain the required experience. That depends on what products you work with and what category of FSP you work for, but you'll certainly need to acquire some experience. You need to do some COB, class of business training in your first year. Within the 6 years, you need to obtain the qualification. There are some exceptions, by the way, to all of this, but we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty here. Almost everybody who is a supervised rep has to, within 2 years, pass the RE5 exam. And that's not a totally easy thing to do. The RE5 exam, as I will be showing you, is pretty tricky. And so it's certainly something that you need to have on your radar if you're a supervised rep, and probably start working to pass it as quickly as possible to make sure that you are able to be absolutely sure of passing it within those 2 years. Now, I said there are two kinds of people who might want to do the RE5 exam. Perhaps you are in the second category, and that is somebody who wants to work in the financial services sector. You're not currently employed in the financial services sector, but you'd like to be. Well, then doing the RE5 exam and getting that on your CV would be an excellent thing to do. It impresses recruiters, it impresses employers to know that you are capable of passing this exam, and also that you already know quite a lot about the financial services sector, because you aren't able to pass the RE5 exam without knowing a fair bit. So two excellent reasons to be here and be trying to pass this exam. So as I've mentioned, there are these 7 steps. I'm not going to go through each of them right now while I'm showing you this slide. Instead, I'm going to go through each of them throughout this presentation. That's really what this presentation is going to be. And as I think I've mentioned to you, I'm going to try to help you climb those first 4 steps today. Obviously, in 1 hour, I'm not able to help you get through the entire thing, but at the end of the hour, when we're standing there on step 4, I'll give you some ideas about how you might want to go about climbing the last 3 steps. So let's start with that very first step at the bottom there, how to become familiar with the role players. And something we like to do at Skillfully is we like to represent the different role players who come up a lot in the exam with a different proudly South African mammal. And for the client, which is mentioned in many of the RE5 exam questions, we represent that with a honey badger. Now, a honey badger is always hungry and is always thinking about what it likes to eat most, which is honey. A client is thinking about financial products. They want to potentially buy or do some kind of transaction with a financial product. Okay, so that's the first 2 kind of little roles here are represented by a honey badger and a honey. That's the client and the financial product that they want. And of course, honey is made by a beehive. Well, that would be the product supplier in our analogy here. So the product supplier makes the financial product that the client is interested in purchasing or doing something with. Let me give you some examples of some product suppliers. I hope you can read this. It will depend a little bit on your screen size, but if you can't read it, don't fret, because there are 2 here that you would be familiar with, I think. Old Mutual, perhaps the biggest product supplier in Southern Africa, and also Outsurance. You can't really miss their ads, but there are lots of others. I'm just showing you some of the O's and one of the P's here. There are so many product suppliers that have been registered by the FSCA, which I'll be telling you about a little bit later, and many of them I've never heard of, so certainly don't feel bad if you haven't heard of Orange Insurance Limited from Northcliffe. Maybe some of those of you in KZN have heard of it. Okay, so there are some examples of product suppliers. Now, of course, one thing the honey badger can do is go and find their own honey, goes directly to the beehive. And similarly, in the world of financial services, a client can go directly to a product supplier and buy the product directly from them. But they often actually want and need more help than that. They want the help of an FSP, a financial services provider. And that is a person or an organization that renders financial services to them in respect of a particular set of financial products. So they are the go-between between the client and the product supplier. We represent at Skillfully the FSP with a boma with a few different kinds of animals in them. And you can imagine these animals working together to give advice to the honey badger about how to get that honey, to advise the client about how to invest in financial products, or perhaps even to play some role in getting that financial product to the client. All right, let me give you a few examples of some FSPs. Some you will have heard of. So you probably will have heard of the Standard Bank of South Africa Limited, which is just a fancy way, like the official company name of Standard Bank. You may have also heard of Alan Gray, which is a famous asset manager in South Africa. Perhaps depending on whether you already have a role in the financial sector, you might have heard of the administrators in Timbeko. I suspect you haven't heard of Aon Investment Management. That's a hedge fund. NBC Holdings, one of the things they do is offer they administer funeral policies. So all of those are examples of FSPs, and there are many, many thousands of FSPs in South Africa, and representatives, the people that have to pass that RE5 within 2 years, they will be working for something like one of these FSPs. So let's have a look inside that FSP and figure out who the role players are within the FSP. And the first is our hero, the meerkat, which is a representative. A representative is employed by an FSP, or maybe might not be employed, they may be mandated, which means that they are given not an employment contract, but instead a written mandate to provide financial services in the name of the FSP. So perhaps the meerkat represents some of you. Then there you can see there the lion, the king of the jungle, and we use the lion to represent the boss effectively. Now, in the financial sector, that boss is called a key individual. They manage or oversee the financial activities of the FSP. And then you can see that there is also a cheetah in there. That cheetah is what we use to represent the supervisor, who takes care of the supervised rep, right? They make sure that the rep is working to meet the requirements that they need to meet in order to become a fully fledged rep and no longer be supervised by them. And then finally, you'll see there's one more character in the FSP, and that is the tall one that has a view of everything, and that is the giraffe, the compliance officer, who ensures that the FSP complies with financial regulation. So those four exist together in the FSP. Now, of course, you can imagine a giant FSP like Standard Bank or Alan Gray has many, many reps and many KIs, key individuals, many compliance officers, many supervisors supervising those reps. But there are lots of FSPs of different sizes, and so there are some smaller ones that will maybe just have one of each. There are even some even smaller ones that won't even have as many as all those four, but we won't get into too many complexities right now. Let me rather now take you to a bunch of other characters, which are the characters that have authority over this world of financial services. And we represent them with birds. And the first of those is the ombud, the wise owl, who independently handles complaints from clients. Another is the Secretary Bird, which is the Financial Intelligence Center, the FIC. And we represent them with a Secretary Bird because they, for an FSP, involve a lot of paperwork. You have to send off all sorts of information to the FIC if you work for an FSP about money laundering and the financing of terrorist activities, and unusual and suspicious transactions and so on. And the most important of the authorities that we discuss with respect to RE5 is the FSCA. I mentioned them earlier. That stands for the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, but you don't have to worry about that because usually the RE5 exam refers to them just simply as the authority, because they are the most important of these three authorities as far as the exam goes. And what the FSCA does is it regulates the conduct of all of the players, or pretty much all of the players that we have introduced you to so far. That's why they have a big role in the RE5 exam. So there we go. That is the world of financial services. Three authorities overlooking the players on the ground, which are really the four different kinds of characters you could get working for an FSP, trying to assist a client with its decisions about financial products coming from a product supplier. All right, good. We have now, I hope, successfully climbed that first step. Hopefully you feel somewhat familiar with the role players. I know we're going quite quickly. What we are going to do is we are going to release this as a recording, and so you will be able to catch up with it if it's gone a little bit fast for you. Let's move on to the second step here, which is understanding what the exam actually tests, right? You know why you might do the RE5, but you don't know what's on the RE5. You may have an idea, and that idea will be strengthened if you have a look at this slide, which tells you that there are 18 pieces of legislation which govern the world of financial services. Again, you might not be able to see all of them. That's not a problem. What you can see is that there are a whole bunch of them that actually adds up to 18 acts and board notices and council rules and so on. What I'll do is I'll just tell you about the first one. Now, the first one is the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Services Act, most commonly called the FASE Act. And the reason it is a big deal on the RE5 is it covers a lot of the characters. It governs the way in which a lot of these characters that we've covered must interact and do their work. And so, for example, it lays out the kind of financial services that an FSP might offer, the kinds of financial products that product suppliers offer, how an FSP might be licensed and how it maintains its license, how it might lose its license, various kinds of duties that the FSPs have, especially when it comes to protecting the interests of clients, how an FSP might debar representatives and when they must do so, the role and the function of that giraffe, the compliance officer, the role and the authority of the owl, the ombud, and so on. So you can really see that there is a lot of information in the FASE Act. And this is true for a lot of these pieces of legislation. What you now need to know is that the RE5 exam tests your knowledge of that legislation. That is what the RE5 exam is all about. Okay, which means we've now climbed that second step. And it's time for me to just give you a little poll, because I want to make sure that while I'm sitting here doing all of the talking, you guys all have a choice. You have a chance to let me know if I am making sense to you. So here you go. You should have a poll just pop up on your screen asking you whether you feel familiar with the role players in the world of financial services, and do you understand that the RE5 exam tests the legislation. And you can't see the results yet. I'll share the results with you in a little bit. But I'm pleased to see that a lot of people are choosing, Yebo, I've got it. And some people are saying, well, kind of. I'd like to watch the recording to be sure. And what makes me very happy is that I'm not seeing anybody who's saying, no way, you lost me on slide 1. So I'm going to end the poll and just share those results with you so that you can see. When you've had enough of looking at the results, you can just close that window. But if you're feeling a little bit unsure, then you're not alone. There are a few of you, and that's fine. As I said, we've been going very quickly, and you can watch that recording and get a little bit more information about it. Okay, so why don't we get back to our slide presentation, and I'm going to move on to the third step, which is knowing about the tasks and QCs. So what is that all about? Well, it's about how the examiners who set the RE5 exam divide up the RE5 curriculum, how they divide up these 18 acts and regulations. And the answer is that they have divided them into 8 buckets, which are called tasks. And then within each bucket, they've got a bunch of qualifying criteria. That's what QC stands for. And each of those qualifying criteria is linked to a few pieces of legislation. So ultimately, the way in which you need to learn the legislation has been cut up, sliced up and diced up by the examiners into these qualifying criteria that sit within tasks. And I think maybe it's easiest to understand this with an image. So I'm going to show you an image in a little bit, but let me just give you an example of these 8 tasks. There they are. We're not going to read through each one of them because I don't think that would be a good use of our time in the short time we have together. But you can see, for example, the first one is described as demonstrating an understanding of the Phase Act as a regulatory framework, right? And that it has 4 QCs. You see that here. And those QCs link in total to 21 legislation references. And let's just have a quick look down here. You can see that it gets worse than 21, right? Task 4 has, gosh, 93 pieces of legislation organized into 14 QCs, right? Task 7, not so hard, only 1 QC there, but it does have 12 legislation references for that 1 QC. So you get an idea of this. I said I would show you an illustration of this. Before I do that, let me just quickly show you, dig down into task 1 here, and just show you the 4 qualifying criteria. So the first one is describing the Phase Act and the subordinate legislation. And to be able to do that, the examiners say, you really need to be familiar with these 3 legislation references. If I jump down to qualifying criteria 4, you'll see that's about the role and function of the compliance officer. And there's all of these pieces of legislation here from 4 different acts and regulations. And so let me show you now this illustration that we've put together to try to help you visualize the curriculum. So there's the Phase Act I told you about a little bit earlier. And there's the 4 sections from, or parts of section 17 that you need to know. And here's some parts of section 18. And here's the phase regulations, which is a different piece of legislation. And that's got regulation 5 in it. And you need to know that. And you need to know parts of the General Code of Conduct, in particular here, section 3, subsection 1. All of those really come under qualifying criteria 4, according to the examiners, which is describing the role and function of a compliance officer, which, as you know, is just one of the 4 qualifying criteria that make up task 1. Okay, so if this seems a little bit complicated, don't worry, it is, right? You kind of should be feeling like this is complicated. And let me make the point a little bit more strongly here. What we've just looked at there, those 3 pieces of legislation and leading into 1 qualifying criterion down here, the 4th one of task 1. Well, just remember that's one little smidgen of the curriculum. And if I tried to represent the whole curriculum, I'd have to show you that there are more references from the same act in the other qualifying criteria, but there are other pieces of legislation that you need to know for task one. And that's just task one. There are another 7 tasks, and they each have their own qualifying criteria. And there are, remember, 18 pieces of legislation. So I'm building that up for you here. And each of those things falls into usually more than one qualifying criterion of quite often more than one task. And wow, what a mess, right? That is a gemors. It's meant to be. It's not meant to be something that you can fully understand and kind of memorize or anything like that. It's really just trying to make the point, wow, the way in which the curriculum is laid out is quite complicated and quite difficult to unravel, right? And so I hope that that has made the point, and that you now know a bit about the tasks and the QCs. At Skillfully, we think that's pretty much all you need to know about the tasks and QCs. And I'll tell you why when we get to step 5. But first, let's just look at step 4, which is about reading the legislation. Remember, the legislation is what you actually need to know for the exam. So why don't we now try to do that? And let's just take a very simple kind of question. Let's imagine you're thinking, okay, I'm going to jump into reading this legislation I need to know for the RE5 exam. And since it's all about financial services providers and financial services, let me just figure out what financial services are. What does that actually mean? And a good way to do that, of course, would be to go to the actual legislation. Now, here's some good news for you. We actually provide the legislation on the Skillfully site for free. Anybody can go there. I'll show you how. You click on news. This is the easiest way to get there anyway. Click on news, and then you'll find that we've got various news here. And if you scroll down, we try to leave it quite near the top. The examinable material for RE5, you can just click on read more there. And then you can see that we have listed the 18 pieces of legislation right here. And if you want to look at the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Services Act, remember that's FASE Act, you just click that one. And we've tried to be as helpful as we can be here by creating a table of contents, which is hyperlinked. So you could go down here to chapter 4. You can return to the table of contents and so on. Now, remember, what we're trying to do is figure out what the definition of financial services. And so let's go to the definitions. And let's go down until we get to financial service. There it is. Okay, look, nice and short. This is going to be easy. It means any service contemplated in paragraph A, B, or C of the definition of financial services provider, including any category of such services. Oh, maybe it's not as simple as I thought, because it just refers to a different definition. But the good news there is that that definition is right beneath us here. Financial services provider. There it is. It means any person other than a rep who, as a regular feature of the business of such person, furnishes advice, that's A, or furnishes advice and renders an intermediary service, or renders an intermediary service. That's the A, B, and C that they referred to up here. Okay, so financial service is advice or intermediary services or both. Okay, but that doesn't really answer the question because we don't really know what those are. Advice is a word that I guess we're familiar with. Intermediary service, maybe not so much. Let's have a look. Do they define advice? Oh, yes, they do. Good. But goodness, that's not so straightforward, is it? It's not as easy as just the English word advice. You can see here, it's a long definition. I'm not going to go through it right now. Let me rather just take you to intermediary services, because I can tell you that will be defined as well. And the bad news there is it's also rather a long definition. And then I've got to tell you something that's also not great news, which is that subsection 3 here then goes and tells us what advice is not, right? And not just that, but it also tells us what intermediary services are not. And so it really is a very complicated answer to what we thought was a simple question, right? We wanted to know, what is the definition of financial services? And what did we get? Well, we got a long wild goose chase here from section 1 definitions, the definition of financial services, to the definition of an FSP, to the definition of advice, to the definition of intermediary services, to section 3, which lists the exclusions of what advice and intermediary services are not. If you're getting the message that answering what looks like a simple question is not so simple when it comes to this legislation, perhaps you can also guess that when it looks like a more complicated question, well, then the answer is even more complex.
And then, Jimmy, if I may add,
Yeah.
it's I think you've expressed the complexity of it beautifully. And if I can add a little bit more, what happens is sometimes after legislation has been published, some years later, there will be more regulations which add more info. So once you've gotten to the bottom of this, you find some years later, there's some regulation which spends further time and attention explaining what intermediary services are and are not. Like that law is not all there is.
Yeah. Yeah. They don't make it easy, huh?
No, no, we do. They don't.
Yeah. So, Nia, I see that you've raised your hand. I want to make sure I get through a lot, but I don't mind if you turn on your mic and ask a question if it's a quick one. Otherwise, just put it in the chat.
Yeah, it's a quick question based on
Yeah.
what Greg just mentioned now that there
Yeah.
may be some other regulations added or so. So what we getting is the updated or latest information, right, in terms of definitions and everything.
Yes.
And what we're gonna get asked in the exam is based on what has been previously published or made available. So it's not gonna be anything new.
Yes, that's right. So the exam is always based on the most recent legislation and the updates to it. And yeah, at Skillfully, we certainly make sure that we are teaching the absolute latest stuff. If you were doing this on your own, we are offering this free session with an encouragement to take our course, because we really do think that it is the easiest way to give yourself the best chance of passing. But if you were to try to do it on your own, you're free to have a go. And there you have to be careful to make sure that you are looking at the latest legislation, which we do put on our site. Greg, did you want to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. So Neo, there's the changes happen several times a year, not at particular preset occasions in the year. So one has to keep checking, as we always do, checking the relevant site for the changes. And there's two kinds of changes. One is they will say, okay, there's this new piece of legislation that's come in and it's included in the curriculum in the following way. So you got to read a new law, okay, or announcement or directive or whatever it may be. The other is, look, it's the same legislation as before. It's the same law, but the law has changed. So really one has to like keep an eagle eye out for any changes during the year, which we always do.
Thanks.
So,
Okay,
so if there's one thing I can say to this group is, sometimes like people pass around like old notes or whatever. If the notes are more than a couple of months old, there's a danger of their being out of date.
Yeah, okay, let me get back to the presentation. Thanks, Nia and Greg, for those contributions. So I've tried to summarize in this red block here what makes it difficult to work through the legislation. It's in disconnected sections. There you saw that we had to hop around between different definitions and different subsections of the FASE Act. Sometimes you'll find that it's actually in different pieces of legislation, the information about just one topic. It misses real world context. So you often find yourself reading this stuff and just thinking like, what does this really mean in the real world? It's very long and wordy. This is written by lawyers and promulgated by politicians, and neither of them are known for being brief and concise and using everyday English. That's why we say here it's written in legalese, which is this kind of this funny word to describe the way in which laws are written. They're not written in the way that we speak. It's incredibly detailed, as you saw there for the definitions of advice and intermediary services. It's full of tricky exceptions, as you saw that advice and intermediary services aren't some of these certain things. And all of this adds up to it just being very hard to remember. And so what you need to do is find a way to make the legislation digestible and understandable and memorable. Okay, so I've got you, I hope, to just around step 4 here, right? We've done all of those things, and let me give you another chance to contribute here. And I want to ask you another question on the poll. So it should pop up for you any second. Now that you know how the tasks and QCs are arranged and have tried reading some legislation, how do you feel? Again, I'm able to see your answers. I'll share them with you in a sec. I'm quite impressed by this group because not everybody has said, I'm freaking terrified. If I was sitting where you are, I would have said that myself. But in fact, only two people are feeling terrified. And most of you, I think, are quite sensibly feeling nervous, right? I'm surprised, frankly, that there are 5 of you who said, I'm chill, this will be easy. Because if that's the case, maybe I haven't made my point strongly enough that of these tasks and these QCs and reading the legislation itself is really quite an audacious thing to set out to do. So I'm going to end the poll and you guys can have a look at the answers yourselves there. There's the results. So yeah, half of you saying quite nervous, I'm not sure how to proceed. And I certainly relate to that half, if not the 3 people who said, I'm freaking terrified. And I'm very impressed by those of you who said, I'm chill, this will be easy. Okay, so back to the presentation, and let's talk about those last 3 steps then. So how are you going to make the legislation digestible and understandable and memorable? Well, this is what Greg and I have been doing in developing our RE5 course. And so we've got some advice for you. You can try to do it yourself. And here's our advice. If you were to set out to do it yourself, maybe some of those of you who say, this is chill, it's going to be easy, might want to try to do this stuff for yourself. So what we'd recommend is that you arrange all of that complicated material with all of those arrows going in all of those directions to the QCs and the tasks into more meaningful units, right? At Skillfully, for example, we offer these 8 units, right? The first one, actually, I showed you some of the slides from it earlier, the meerkat and the lion and the ombud and so on. Those are the actors and the services and the products and the laws, right? Just to make sure that you understand the lay of the land and who the characters are. And then we move on to the FSP license and how to get that, how it might be lost, and so on. Communicating with clients is a separate unit, and so on. If you look further down our list, you'll see debarment there. And what we've done there is we've taken the 8 pieces of legislation that have something to say about debarment, which have been organized into 2 tasks and 6 qualifying criteria by the examiners. And instead, we put it in 1 unit, everything you need to know right there. So that's something that you could try to do. Also, try to make that legislation more meaningful. Remember, it's long, it's wordy, it's written in legalese, it's in various parts. One thing we do, I don't know how easy it will be for you, but perhaps there's some kind of trick you could do if you wanted to do this on your own, is we represent the various kinds of characters, but also the things that can happen to them with images. So here's an example of debarment. This is where the representative gets told by the FSP, you may no longer actually provide financial services. You can't work for the FSP, and you actually can't work for any FSP once you are debarred, right? And so we represent that with an image that we hope is memorable and meaningful for people. Another way in which we make the legislation meaningful is we show them real-world examples of the stuff we're talking about. So what you can see here is an example of a debarment order. to protect the person's privacy, although this is actually public information. We've redacted out their name. You can see that this person has been prevented from being a representative for the next 10 years, right? Because they have been debarred. And when you actually read a publication like this, you actually start to get a much better sense of what this term debarment really means. I'll give you another example. We also, when we teach debarment, we show the actual notification form to our students, and then they can think about filling out this notification form, and that will help them remember that it's actually the FSP that does that, right? Because that might be a question on the exam, is who's responsible for doing the debarment? It's often the FSP itself, and there's a particular person at the FSP that will actually run that process. And later on in section 5 of this form, you actually have to indicate the grounds of the debarment. And one of the key ways in which that might happen is if you don't comply with the fit and proper requirements. Which fit and proper requirements? Well, these 4 here. And there's another way you might actually commit some material contravention of non-compliance with provisions of the Act. And then you might also remember something else by looking at this form. You might remember that 15 days from the date of debarment, you have to send a whole bunch of documentary evidence and information to the authority to let them know exactly why this person has been debarred. So by looking at the real world artifacts here, you actually get a much better sense of what this legislation really is talking about. It makes it more meaningful. We also summarize the legislation and translate it from legalese into English. And so, we talked earlier about the definition of financial services. Well, you can see here, these are some slides on financial services. We point out how it's advice, it's intermediary services. We use images of the animals to help people kind of associate these terms with something in the real world. We talk about what advice is. We bring in that subsection 3 stuff on what advice is not. And we do the same thing for intermediary services. And we find that learning it in this kind of way is just so much easier for somebody than actually trying to read the legislation itself, like we did earlier. Another thing we'd encourage you to do, if you were to work through this on your own, is to establish broad principles to shortcut a lot of the detail, right? Because there is actually an immense amount of detail in this legislation that you're supposed to know for the exam, but you can actually learn a lot of it simply by looking for the patterns and the principles that emerge regularly. Right, so I'm going to give you an example here. A broad principle that comes up a lot is that the legislation aims to protect clients. But the legislation is reasonable, and it doesn't expect FSPs to go beyond what would be reasonable to protect clients. Right? And so if you understand this principle, that the legislation is there to protect clients, but not beyond what's reasonable, then you can actually answer some of the questions on the RE5 exam without even knowing the material in detail, right? We wouldn't encourage you to go into the exam without knowing as much detail as you can, but the human brain is limited and you probably won't know all the detail. Let me show you how just understanding this principle might help you answer an RE5 exam question. So this isn't a real one. We don't have real ones for you. The real ones are all kept secret, but we know what they are like. And so we have got lots of questions that we give to our students. So here's something that we might give to our students. This question asks, when giving the client info, which of the following is a rep required to do? And so the first answer there, A, is prioritize the interests of the FSP. Now, surely that would not be protecting the client. If you've understood that the FSP is a separate entity that's supposed to help the client, then you should understand that if they were just prioritizing the interests of the FSP, the rep would not be protecting the clients. Similarly, In B, emphasizing the maximum financial return that the client might earn from the relevant products would also not protect clients, because when you tell somebody how they might win the lottery, they start thinking about how they might spend their millions, and they're not thinking about the risk that they lose their money. So neither of those things protect the clients very well. If we go down to D, repeating the information in a weekly communication to serve as a regular confirmation, even if the information hasn't changed, that's going beyond what's reasonable, surely. And so that leaves only C. C says, describe the fees in monetary terms, or if not possible, then describe the basis of the calculation. Now, if you've understood the principle, even if you didn't remember that detail, you could still correctly work out, by eliminating the other options, that C must be the correct answer. It protects the clients, but not beyond what's reasonable, so it conforms with that broad principle. None of the other three options does that. I hope that's convinced you that it's worth trying to look for the broad principles in the legislation. Though there are many broad principles, there are also important exceptions, and so you want to highlight those for yourself. Here, for example, is a slide that we use on fit and proper. Fit and proper is what a rep is if they are meeting all of the requirements, like our meerkat there with a toned, it's not even a six-pack, it's an eight-pack there. And so you can see that we are emphasizing that while most reps must complete a required number of CPD hours, there is this important exception relating to category 1 reps of certain types. And we won't get into the detail here, that's not for today, and we're running short on time anyway. But you get the idea that you do need to highlight these exceptions for yourself because the examiners do like to ask about some of them. And then we'd also recommend you use as many tricks as possible to help your memory. So what we like to do is create tables with information that summarizes it neatly and contrasts and compares it. We find that that is often a good way to memorize a lot of information that you can take into the exam. We also like to use timelines. You saw a version of this timeline earlier, and we use them quite a lot because we find that that also helps people remember things much better. And then we also, as I think you've seen already, we use a lot of images to represent different characters and hopefully make the legislation more meaningful. I like that one on the right there, a meerkat wearing a lion mask. So that's a rep pretending to be a KI. And there you have the authority, the FSCA, staring them down. This is used in our slide about how the FSCA is meant to assess the honesty of reps. So we said the legislation has all these kinds of problems with it. What we have to do is make it more digestible and understandable and memorable. And to do that, what we've done is we've arranged units by topic. We've given it real-world context. We've made it concise and plain. Study material, we've written it in simple English. We've focused on broad principles, but we have noted the exceptions, and we've given ourselves lots of memory aids. So that is an approach that we strongly recommend because it is the approach that we ourselves have taken. And so we think that that would get you one step closer to being able to pass that RE5 exam. But it's not everything, because at the end of the day, you actually have to write the exam. And whenever you write an exam, it's not just about knowing the material that's the curriculum for the exam, it's also about having the right technique to answer the exam questions. So that's what we're going to talk about now. What we do is we recommend a bunch of kind of broad strategic methods for approaching the exam. You can see some of them here. We also give our students lots and lots of practice. So in those 2 days, that course that we'll be offering on the 7th and 8th of April, I think if you were to join us, you would do about 80 different MCQs with us during the course of the program. This is using an app called Mentimeter. where you answer on your phone. You can see here 9 people got this one right. This is a screenshot from one of our recent courses. They answered A, and there were 3 people who answered wrongly there, and then we have an opportunity to talk about that and why A is the right answer and so on. And that's a really great way to learn, because when you actually feel that sting of getting the wrong answer, it's so much easier to remember the stuff. And then there are those units we also share with our students. So those practice MCQs. So we would recommend that you try, if you're going to do this online and you don't want to do the Skillfully course, you don't have 977 Rand, you can maybe try to find some questions online. There are a few out there. We can't vouch for their quality, of course, but that is an option for you. You certainly want to do as much practice as you can. And then speaking of practice, that would be the final step, to revise and practice. And so what we do for our students is we give them all of this study material here. This is on an app called Bookshelf. You can see there all of our units summarized, all of our slides given to people, where we have not included absolutely all of the legislation in the slides. We've got extra notes there. You can see those notes there, for example. And in between the slides there. And so they've got something solid to study from. And then once they've done one unit, they can move on to the next and so on. So that obviously helps massively with revision. And then practicing as many questions as possible. I think I mentioned already that we provide our students with all of the 80 or so MCQs that come up during the course, so that they can do them again as many times as they like. We also provide all sorts of useful summaries of the highly testable stuff. So students can also identify for themselves from our material which are the most memorable and the best summaries. There are ways using our app to bookmark things and make notes about them, and even create flashcards from them. And then we would recommend, before you write the exam, just before you write the exam, to practice like you're going to play, actually do some mock exams. And we provide our students with 2 different mock exams where they can work through them, see how they did, get some feedback about them, and then try the next one. And it's not only a good way to help them with some of that material, but also get them in the mindset for actually working through questions just like the ones they're going to have to in the exam. So there we go. We have climbed, I hope you agree, up the first step, the second, the third, and the fourth. You've had a go at all of those things today, and that's put you in a better position, I hope, than you were an hour ago. The last 3 steps are ones that you still have to take. And what we would love to invite you to do is to join us and take these steps with us. We've done the hard work I was talking about earlier to make everything digestible and understandable and memorable. We've put together all of the things you would need in order to do to develop your exam technique and to do the revision and practice. And so if you have the money, we really would strongly recommend that you do take the course.